volunteer when they find that committees are aged 57 to 65 and meet during the day. So, there are all sorts of challenges that we've got about volunteering, and it's something we're going to be looking at in the next year. But are other charities struggling with finding volunteers, motivating them? Because we do talk, it is talked about a lot that this is where we should go. There should be more volunteers in the community.
What we're hearing is that managing volunteers is getting more difficult, especially with the millennial generation who are interested in micro-volunteering, in small episodic types of engagement.
Yeah.
And that's a very different style of volunteering from what sociologists call the civic core. People probably more of my age or your age who thought more about volunteering as entire blocks of days or weeks at a time. And for that younger millennial generation, the argument is that volunteering is more about them as the individual than it is about service or the organisation that they're volunteering for. I'd argue to you that a lot of policy over the last 5 years has all been about getting people in terms of volunteering, and I think what they are now realising is that actually it's not a supply problem that we have, it's a demand problem. So I suspect that the policy focus might start to shift a bit more to thinking about managing volunteering. But having said that, the big volunteering policy announcement was that you will get 3 days paid leave if you want to volunteer.
But 3 days won't even let you be a trustee. I mean, that's, the MS Society has their meetings during the day. We have 6 days a year, and on top of that, you want them to be on committees, so you're actually talking, say, 12 days a year. So that also tends to affect, to some extent, who applies to be a trustee.
There's a great faith in technology here. So on the brokering side, the investment can do it, and it's argued that people will find opportunities much more using technology now. But also the argument, I think, in terms of technology is that it should be much easier to start keeping records, to almost have your digital CV or your passport that you take from one organisation to another, and then you can use that in terms of your employability. So there may be technical solutions there, but I'm not quite sure how.
Carl, would you think, I went to visit Help the Heroes the other day, and interestingly, of course, they've always relied on a very funding-driven volunteering route to now their service delivery. And they had some of those issues. They had people who've been with them for 7 years who are now retiring and weren't actually able to do that, and how would they actually encourage more people. I think part of the issue maybe for organisations to have to look at how they can be more flexible to meet that different requirement for volunteers. So I think there's quite a difficult option there. But I also, talking to Catherine at Samaritans, I'm always intrigued by Samaritans, just the whole organisation is almost run by volunteers. So certainly our colleagues in volunteering, Justin's just left the room, but our colleagues in volunteering here are looking very hard at how maybe we can get some of those messages out and some of those learnings out into the sector, because there are very real different ways people are engaged with their volunteering base. Sorry, please, do you have a question?
Well, I was just there's this sort of DIY concept, volunteering yourself, people wanting to do it themselves thing. And we certainly see that with viral movements that spread up and go global very, very rapidly. And in terms of the three days a year, we've worked with a lot of companies on 3 days a year or thereabouts model. It just means designing it differently to be transactional. There's a specific piece of work, it takes this amount of time and so on. To take an example, Deloitte use a £1 system, so they actually have an internal currency. This is part of your sort of fee earning piece. So yeah, very digital, very much integrated into the system.
Well, I went to see PwC, actually, the head of charities there, and he made that point that they are encouraged to do the days. But actually, the days is still not enough. If you go on to a board like the MS Society,
it's what can you do with that stream of benefits and redesigning things around it. And of course, a lot of people are, they are volunteering entirely for themselves. They're doing the self-employment version of charity. Very large numbers.
And this whole area of the sort of potential backlash from possibly like Priti Patel, who became a minister as a result of picking up on some of the issues, one could argue, Do people have views about how the sector might actually respond to some of that? Because it raises quite difficult issues. I think it links to transparency, Carl. And you know, do people feel very strongly about we should be more transparent? Or is there a sort of dialogue to be had in a way that change that you're talking about here?
There's a really good TED talk, and unhelpfully I'm not going to remember who it's by, but it's an American entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, who talks about the very different expectations of charities than we do. Sorry?
Dan Pallotta, I think.
Thank you.
That ring a bell?
Yes. And he talks about how what we applaud in a private sector company, we denigrate in a charity, such as taking risk, paying good money to get the right people, innovating, all these things. And I think the argument that he makes is the argument we all need to make.
I don't think that's changing now.
How do you?
Well, sorry, my own experience is that charity boards generally are becoming more commercially astute because it's now, there are a lot more companies. I mean, Trustees Unlimited, we placed 25 trustees from Barclays last year. And it all gradually filtered through. I mean, to me, the commercial sector isn't a sort of dirty word in a charity. There are some good people in there. And we're gradually getting them into charities who are becoming more business-like. So I don't see it as such an issue.
I don't think it's an issue for the sector. I think it's the perception that we need to challenge.
Yes.
So I think the sector, like you say, has totally woken up to the benefits of having that commercial mindset in some ways. But I think that the public have not come with us. So they still will be saying, oh, we're paying chief executive an awful lot of money, rather than thinking, well, that's because that's a very talented person and they're running a very big, complicated organisation. So I think it's more about the perception than what we're actually doing.
Yes, I still don't think it's as bad as it used to be. It used to be dreadful. You know, some people have always used to say, well, I don't think charities staff should be paid anything. You know, you can't run 120 million turnover charity on with somebody who's not being paid or being paid below market rate.
I think that's still the majority view.
I think we get it.
I think it's a very difficult argument to completely balance the commercial and the charity sector on the basis of what they're doing, what they manage, because there is a big public perception, which is many is correct given how many people work with the private sector or self-employed, that charities don't generate their own money. So if you're talking about somebody who runs a local factory, they're in charge of keeping that afloat. And there is, I think, my kind of feeling is I think the public got a bit tired about charities saying we do a good job and we pay ourselves X. I think there has to be something more to back up why this is a good job, rather than I do. And I think that we're still in slightly straitened times. My feeling why the Conservatives got it is most people are frightened that 2008 will come back again and what they've built up will go. So people are aware of tax-generating organisations. So if we say we're just as valid, it's a difficult one because we do have big tax breaks. There's reasons why we should be more efficient than some commercial organisations. And I think we have to address the concerns of people that actually look, where is this money coming from?
But surely, I would argue that it's even worse in the public sector. I mean, I had 15 months in there and they're not generating any money at all. They're just spending.
Perhaps I can't speak for the public sector, but in terms of charities and the wages that there has been criticism and it keeps coming up, you know, it never really goes away. I think there is a political, it's a nice political tidbit to grab the sector by about how do we, because we're all different. We're not like public sector, we don't have a kind of uniform way of setting salaries. We come up with through our own policies and our own perceptions of need. So it does make us slightly more vulnerable as well because there is that big variety.
Can I just come back to that point there? Again, going back to the US, our equivalent in the US is an organisation called Independent Sector. The chief exec, Diane Raviv, said a couple of years ago, the millennial generation are sector agnostic. They just want to do some good and they don't care where they do it. And I think that's a big challenge that we've got now in the UK because I think that sector blind approach is absolutely something that the current administration have and will continue. They want to, I do actually think many people in the administration believe in social justice and we want to change the country for a better place. But quite a few of them, I think, are not convinced that charity is the best organisations to do it. They actually think that business can do better
Yes, I
in
think
terms of
they do.
social good.
I think
And I think we have to challenge that. So coming back to sort of the tax-based bit, which was your second point, I think the traditional way that charities have approached budgets and spending reviews is to say, we want you to spend X on Y.
Yeah.
I think hanging on to what we've got at the minute in terms of tax breaks will be a good outcome from the spending review.
One of the things I've been thinking about a lot is that we call ourselves a third sector, and over the last 10, 15 years or so, we've taken on contracts from the state sector, and in doing that, embraced in some way, tainted ourselves by sort of taking on a contract and then delivering what were public services. And now that squeeze on what you get, what we give in return for those contracts is going to really hit the third sector and, I would argue, compromise it. So there are a number of organisations who aren't campaigning and lobbying. There's no policy. It's a purely service delivery. And therefore, are we in a situation where we're saying that's a third sector activity, but we have a fourth sector which is about campaigning and lobbying. And can the two still sit together? Can they sit together? How does NCPO position itself within the sector? Are you the front people for contracts commissioning? Or are you lobbying and saying there is a necessity, there's a need to have a voice for the voluntary sector, which is about representing those that are most in need, and this is how we're going to do it. Because the government are expecting us to go and test. They're saying, you're telling me I'm doing it wrong. If we go to them and say, you're doing it wrong, but give us money so we can keep telling you that you're doing it. We keep doing it. We can turn around and go, you're still doing it wrong. You're still not giving us enough money. So I think there's an issue for the sector. Are we third sector or are we fourth sector? And where do we sit? Where do we go more down the commercial route?
Just following on from what you're saying, I think there's another strand within there which doesn't fall into either one camp or the other. Because when you're delivering services for government contracts, because we're not business, we don't have to generate profit, any surplus that we generate can actually go back into the services that we're providing and build around them, which then adds value.
Yeah.
I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that many of these services, the charities, I don't believe we're third sector because I'm not third to anything. So I'm civil society. Sorry, it's a bit trite, but Carl has a much more erudite view of why we've arrived at the term civil society. And NCPO has been using that term for now on 6 years. But many of these services were delivered by charities before we had statutory bodies to do it. So if we look historically at society, I think sometimes we lose sight, and maybe some of the answers to some of the conundrums we're facing are there. And I have no problem if organisations, are working, as Victor would say, Victor Adewale, not for dividend, putting the money back into services to add that value back into what we're giving to people. I'm interested to see...
The reason I mentioned that point is because that can sometimes achieve the same objective as lobbying.
I wouldn't disagree.
I'd like to come back on this service delivery versus lobbying thing. I fundamentally believe that campaigning, influencing is part of our DNA, and that we have to do that as well as delivering services. And many organisations I've come across have said that it's actually blending the two that actually is really important, because if you have direct experience of delivering the service, you then have the evidence to inform your campaigning. But I think what we've got to do at the minute, given the administration that we've just elected, is to be frank, think Tory. And I don't think we're thinking Tory enough in terms of how we think about campaigning and influencing. So I would argue that a classic Tory position is that campaigning by civil society is the last bulwark against an overweening state. And that's it's the last bulwark against an overweening state to stop a state becoming too powerful. Because most Tories are small states. So we have to make that argument. And then I think the second argument, and I see Philip is trying to get in here, we've been working with Philip to try and think about a clause that Eric Pickles and the Department for Communities and Local Government have just introduced into grant agreements from DCLG. And that clause says that if you receive a grant from us, you're not allowed to influence us or campaign against us. I think the Tory response that you have to try and think about there is that there's another bit of government that says we're interested in open government, we're interested in getting as many thoughts and as talents as possible into the policy making process so that we have more efficient and more effective government. And I think that's what we've got to try and do on the influence thing, say this leads to better, more efficient government. On your contracting thing, absolutely right, but my worry is, based on what my members are telling us, is that they're being asked to subsidise contracts with voluntary income at the moment.
Philip, did you?
Yeah, I don't really want to drag the debate away from campaigning, which I'm very much in favour of, and of course people should do it. I just don't think there is one sector. It's loads of people trying to achieve useful public purposes. And I'm also very much in favour of people delivering those public services through this sector. I think it does, we do it very well. But your point, Carl, about thinking Tory, or perhaps even thinking taxpayer, and how the sector responds. One thing the sector is doing, and it's slowly developing, is understanding the need and the methodologies for demonstrating impact. And that is a way we can sell the story of the sector. I think sometimes we're a little defensive, we compare ourselves, I've heard it today, comparing ourselves to the public sector or the private sector. I'm not sure we need to compare ourselves to the public or private sectors. We aren't, I said a moment ago, we're not just one sector, there are lots of different people doing useful things. We need to be able to demonstrate how those things are achieving real results. Very difficult in some areas of work. There's no doubt about it, really, really difficult. But that's, I think, one of the big stories the sector needs to take back to the government. I'm going to stop there.
I have two reflections in response to that. First is that I think we've got some thinking to do in our sector about our basic operational model, in the sense that if you talk to grant makers, they will argue that they've operated on what you might call a pump priming model, where a voluntary organisation identifies intervention, hopefully it proves that it works, grant maker funds that intervention and scales it up a little bit or pilots it, and then you go to government and say, please carry on funding this intervention and scale it up. Well, that model is broken. As I heard someone say, the landscape is littered with rusty pumps. Here, for me, the slide that I just put up is an organisation called Artlift. It's funded, I think, or run by NHS Gloucestershire. And this is something that one of NCDO's, its cultural commissioning programme, has been involved with. And for me, Philip, this is what sort of the type of impact measurement that I think we have to do now. So Artlift is a social prescribing project, if you all know what that is. And essentially the argument made by the GP involved is that people come into his surgery with depression. He prescribes them with citalopram and other drugs, and all the evidence from the medical journals, he says that they don't work. And every time someone crosses the threshold, it costs 50 quid, something like that. And because the drugs don't work, they keep coming back. So they've done a cost-benefit analysis of an alternative method, which is instead spend 10 weeks with an artist and learn how to paint. And the propensity to come back to the GP afterwards is lower. They know how much it costs to send them to an artist, they've got a randomised controlled trial, and they can show the cashable saving that social prescribing results in. I think that's the sort of impact measurement that we've got to do, about cashable savings.
Sorry, the gentleman to your right. Yes, you gentleman with glasses.
Linking to that point, you see social investment as a challenge and a threat to the sector. So if I had some money to invest, I'd probably invest in a social investment that meets a social need that's going to give a small amount of return maybe over 10 years, because in my mind it would say they're well run, they're going to make a small profit, not a massive amount, versus putting it into a charity that may be pump priming and may not actually deliver any water. Is that going to be a challenge for us in this sector going forward?
Can I declare an interest here? I'm a non-exec director of Charity Bank as well, so I'm sort of not without baggage in this area. from what I can see, the big opportunity here for our sector is that I don't think we're deploying our philanthropic capital effectively enough. I think there are areas where we are spending donations that could be run using fees, okay? And there are possibly areas where we want to grow where we are using donations, where social investment could make a difference. I think if we can get the narrative right and be clear that social investment is not a replacement for funding, which I think was the message we got wrong in the last Parliament, I think we could have a more nuanced conversation about where to go. And from what I can see, individual donors are behaving more like investors and they're interested in recycling capital. The challenge I think the social investment community's got, and Geeta knows far more about this than I do, is that there's a wall of money waiting there to be invested and we don't have enough investment opportunities.
Cliff, did you want to?
Well, I was coming at this from a different end, and there's two things coming together. I don't think the Preeti Patel style of attack on us is because she's stupid and doesn't understand how big charities have to work. It's because she understands perfectly where our Achilles heel is, and she's worried about the campaigning impact, negative impact on the Conservative Party. So she's found our Achilles heel. So why haven't we found their Achilles heel? Or why haven't we found our killer winner? And the sort of the what works line is a really interesting one. The government's now created 7 or 8 what works centres. Very rigorous. Which of these interventions actually delivers, which doesn't. Where's our one? Where are we? We haven't owned that space. Somebody else owned it, which means they design systems and so on. So there's two things coming together. The response to the Preeti Patel style of attack is probably to ignore it and to come in on a different place. Come in on the place which is our strength. And our strength is probably a combination of engagement with people and people being engaged with us, the volunteering side. Speaking not from the CEO of a charity, but allowing that group of people to speak their own, and to understand what works for us, what we can do that really delivers value. Getting into a funk about it or nasty, why they're being so horrible to us, they're just bloody Tories. Well, we've tried that before. I'm old enough to have seen that one in the Thatcher era, and boy did it fail big time.
So I ran Reunite, which is for adopted children, so it was Tom Bluff, and it was very beneficially led. And what worked with the Tories last time around was that these women would just go and tell the Tory minister exactly what it was like, and I stood there, kind of trying to raise a bit of money, keep the office going, doing a bit of comms, but they were the ones that really socked the punch and got us government money and did it. And I think there's a real argument for, because in the professionalisation of charities, you get your CEOs go up front and your professionals go up front. But beneficiaries get wheeled on almost as, so here's your comms manager managing your beneficiaries, they've gone through, and you're looking after them, and it's really good. So it's slightly muted and softened and possibly not about, the people talking to the people. I think
the mental health law spent 15 years working on enabling the people they're working for to speak rather than speaking themselves, and identifying what really works. And the result of that is a priority in the NHS from all parties, and the NHS sticking, was it now 10 million a year, isn't it, on campaigning. On campaigning for better attitudes towards people with mental health problems. So it is possible, but it's possible if you come from a different place rather than resisting taxes.
I think you've weaved a nice story with the Stu Phillips issue. For me, it's always quite interesting in a way NCVO are part of the issue as well as part of the solution on those. But because we talk about the sector, but actually the vast majority of the sector aren't paid staff. The vast majority of people aren't necessarily, they're agnostic possibly in political terms. And we're doing quite a lot of work, as you may know, Cliff, at the moment with the private sector, and I had a dialogue which said just because people work in the private sector doesn't mean they sacrifice babies on a Sunday. I mean, for God's sake, you know, most people who are involved in working of any sort are actually out there doing good in their communities. And I think you're right, there's an agnostic thing. In a way, we should respond more effectively to our customer base or to our beneficiary base and to our supporters, many of whom will not be interested in the political issue. And campaigning to me isn't necessarily a political issue. And you're right, maybe we need to find a way of actually articulating it in a non-politicized perspective, which is difficult, but it's very real. And mental health might be a really good example. Do we have any other questions?